As we embark on the 174th year of the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin, we wish to pay tribute and honor the 300th anniversary of the Grand Lodge of England, from whom the Grand Lodge of Wisconsin derives its origin. One of the great things about studying history is learning about why something happened. Paul Harvey made a career out of sharing the backstories on many historical events and people. Let's face it, the fact that something happened is not nearly as interesting as what led to it happening. For example, the Packers beat the Lions in 2015 in Detroit. No big deal, right? Over the last few decades, the Packers beat the Lions in Detroit many times. But when you learn that they won the game on a Hail Mary pass on the final play with no time left on the clock, where Aaron Rodgers threw the ball about 65 yards in the air, it makes the event much more interesting. Even more so, and how quickly we forget, that final play was set up by the Packers, then in desperation mode, who completed a pass to the left flat with 6 seconds remaining and began the typically unsuccessful series of laterals, hoping that the field might open up for one of the ball carriers to make it into the end zone. On that play, the second lateral came back to Rodgers, who was immediately corralled by a Lion defender and thrown to the turf, but who inadvertently grabbed Rodgers' face mask on the play. And of course, flags flew. Well, a football game can't end on a defensive penalty. So the Packers got to line up to run one more play with no time remaining left on the clock. And the rest, they say, is history. Or, as Paul Harvey would say, and now you know the rest of the story. So the fact that the Grand Lodge of England got its start 300 years ago is not nearly as interesting as the backstory of what led to it, and, in my opinion, is not nearly as interesting as what emanated from it. Just imagine how the world has changed in 300 years. We can easily cite the obvious: mobility, air travel, automobiles, electricity, computers, long-distance communication, actually global communication with satellites orbiting the planet, the internet. Now, these are just in the last 100. Less recent, but equally important: vaccines, water purification, refrigeration, structural steel, and perhaps the greatest contribution that changed the world: agricultural automation. Without it, people remain agrarian, barely able to raise enough food for their own families to survive a single winter. In the span of 300 years, maps have been redrawn, coastlines have changed, cities sprang up and died, entire countries have come and gone, new ones were born. Freemasonry, notwithstanding, has still survived. The attentive ear receives the sound from the instructive tongue, and the mysteries of Freemasonry are safely lodged in the repository of a faithful breast. Truly, an institution that has outlived the fortunes of kings and the mutations of empires. Now, let us transport ourselves, jump through the wormhole, and land in London, June 24th, 1717. Officially, the premier Grand Lodge of England was founded this day when 4 existing lodges gathered at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard in London and constituted themselves a Grand Lodge. The 4 lodges had previously met a year earlier at the Apple Tree Tavern, where they designated their chairman to be the eldest Master Mason, and constituted themselves a Grand Lodge pro tempore in due form. It was at that meeting in 1716 that they resolved to hold the assembly annually to come together and jointly celebrate the feast of St. John the Baptist, at which time they would then choose a Grand Master from among themselves, which they did the following year. All 4 lodges were simply named after the public houses where they were accustomed to meet. At the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard, the lodge now called Lodge of Antiquity No. 2. The Crown Ale House in Parker's Lane off Drury Lane. The Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street, Covent Garden. The lodge now called Lodge of Fortitude and Old Cumberland Lodge No. 12. And the Rummer and Grapes Tavern in Channel Row, Westminster. The lodge now called Royal Somerset House and Inverness Lodge No. 4. While the 3 London lodges were mainly operative lodges, the Rummer and Grapes by the Palace of Westminster appears to have been primarily a lodge of accepted and speculative gentlemen masons. Little is known of their assemblies in the earliest years because minutes of their meetings were not recorded for the first 6 years. However, in 1723, the organization became a regulatory body, more than just a feast celebrating the festival of St. John the Baptist, because it was in this year that minutes were taken, and the Reverend Dr. James Anderson was commissioned to digest the old Gothic constitutions of Freemasonry, which included a great deal of the history of Freemasonry dating back to biblical times, all the way to defining the method of constituting a new lodge. But why even meet? Why become a Grand Lodge? For that matter, why were lodges even becoming lodges? For answers to these questions, we have to look at how the world had changed in the 300 years before them. Certain developments and inventions literally changed the world. Saltpeter, better known as gunpowder. Durable and consistent wood-based paper. The printing press, which was really the advent of mass communication. The steam engine. As in all ages, countries and governments came and went. New ones were born. And Freemasonry survived it all. So what was it that led to the formation of lodges? How were these developments instrumental? While the actual origin of Freemasonry is yet unknown, some things are absolutely certain. An evolution was taking place in the assemblies of practicing stonemasons. They developed a system of qualifying apprenticeship, advancement, and examination, with an emphasis on education and demonstrating proficiency of fundamental truths. And believe it or not, these assemblies of practicing stonemasons actually called themselves lodges. And as we learned earlier, it was quite customary to name the lodge after the place of its meeting, which, prior to becoming a predominantly social institution, was generally the cathedral at which they were laboring. The oldest records held within the Grand Lodge of Scotland are minutes of a meeting held at the Lodge of Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel, No. 1, which date from 1599, over 100 years before the formation of the Grand Lodge of England. As we all know, these cathedrals took decades and sometimes centuries to build. The new St. Peter's Basilica, built on the site of the original temple in the heart of Vatican City, was begun in 1506 and completed in 1626, 120 years. Roslin Chapel in Roslin, Scotland, a cathedral of the Edinburgh Diocese, had its groundbreaking in 1456 and was completed 100 years later, around 1556. This chapel was one of the last cathedral-style buildings employing the artisan craftsmanship of the traditional stonemasons that were so influential in the architecture and construction across much of Europe, dating back nearly 1,000 years, as early as the year 313, when Emperor Constantine I legalized Christianity. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris had its groundbreaking in the year 1163 and was completed in 1345, a span of 182 years. And King Solomon's Temple was constructed between 800 and 900 BC. Since the construction of these buildings spanned decades and centuries, it was necessary to constantly educate generations of new workers on the plans, the progress, the culture, the standards. Emanating from the practice of stonemasons were certain rules of conduct, and as literacy emerged, these were written down and were called charges. The oldest of the old charges is the Regis poem, written around 1450. The document relates how the craft of masonry was brought to England during the reign of King Athelstan in the mid-900s, and tells how all the masons of the land came to the king for direction as to their governance, and how Athelstan, together with the nobility and landed gentry, forged the 15 articles for the master concerning both moral behavior and the operation of a work on a building site. Not long after, in the 1480s, the Cook manuscript was penned. The Matthew Cook manuscript is the second oldest of the old charges, or Gothic constitutions of Freemasonry, and the oldest known set of charges to be written in prose. It contains some repetition, but compared to the Regis poem, there is also much new material. After an opening Thanksgiving prayer, the text enumerates the 7 liberal arts, giving precedence to geometry, which it equates with masonry. According to the legends, Freemasonry dates back to the time of the construction of King Solomon's Temple. This enormous structure required a highly organized workforce and led to stonemasons, architects, and others being organized into various grades or guilds, each with its own responsibilities. British archaeologist Sir William Petrie, while excavating in the Libyan desert in the late 1880s, unearthed papyrus records describing secret meetings of such a guild taking place around 2000 BC. The records concerned not only matters such as working hours, wages, and rules for the labor, but also the relief and assistance for workers in distress and for widows and orphans. While the operative masons were forming lodges and evolving a form of ritualistic masonry, they were not alone. On Friday, October 13th of 1307, the Templar Knights were officially excommunicated by Pope Clement V, and in a conspiracy to absolve his kingdom of extensive debts owed to the Knights, King Philip IV of France ordered a mass arrest of all Templars and their property to be confiscated. During forced interrogation by royal agents at the University of Paris 2 weeks later, Desmarais confessed to a Templar initiation ritual, which allegedly proved heresy among the order. 5 years later, at the Council of Vienne, the Order of Knights Templar was abolished by papal decree. And 2 years after that, on March 14th of 1414, Jacques Desmarais was burned at the stake just outside the Notre Dame Cathedral. As many as 57 Templars were burned at the stake. But over the course of the decade, hundreds escaped capture and fled to nearby countries, most notably Scotland, Ireland, and England. And there is some evidence even across the Atlantic to Nova Scotia and northeast Canada. The Knights Templar, founded in 1119, operated under a strict code of moral conduct. They were devoutly religious. They were led by a Grand Master, and they conducted new members through an initiation ritual. It is believed they practiced an ancient form of rituals and ceremonies, transcended to them from records found while occupying and excavating the ruins of King Solomon's Temple. It is entirely possible they founded their order specifically to resurrect this ancient craft. The United Grand Lodge of England, as it is known today, had its origin under the name of the Premier Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. The new Grand Lodge was evidently not immediately attractive to the older St. John's or independent lodges, who already found much to dislike about the organization. During the 1730s and 40s, antipathy increased between the London Grand Lodge and the Grand Lodges of Ireland and Scotland. Irish and Scottish Masons visiting and living in London considered the London Grand Lodge to have deviated substantially from the ancient practices of the craft. As a result, these Masons felt a stronger kinship with the unaffiliated London lodges. The aristocratic nature of the London Grand Lodge and its members alienated other Masons, causing them also to identify with the unaffiliated lodges. So on July 17th of 1751, representatives of 5 lodges gathered at the Turk's Head Tavern in London and formed a rival Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge of England according to the old institutions. They considered that they practiced a more ancient and therefore purer form of Masonry, passed down to them through the Knights Templar, and called their Grand Lodge the Ancients' Grand Lodge. They called those affiliated with the premier Grand Lodge by the pejorative epithet, the Moderns. These two unofficial names stuck. A young Benjamin Franklin was one of the earliest of the Moderns, being accepted into the fraternity in 1731, only 14 years after the premier Grand Lodge of England was formed. 62 years later, in 1813, they reconciled their differences and formed the United Grand Lodge of England, prevailing today. It is at this point that the history gets really interesting, because it is from here that we examine why lodges became lodges, and we tie it to what has happened because they did. To understand these things, we need to examine the political undercurrents that were stewing in these centuries. It's kind of interesting that in today's world we have instant gratification at every turn. Microwave ovens heat food in mere seconds. Telephones span oceans and allow us to talk to loved ones in real time. We have live television coverage. But in the 1400s through the 1600s, no such instant anything existed. But the times, they were a-changin'. In the year 1381, there was a major uprising across large parts of England, known today as the Peasants' Revolt. It had various causes, including the economic and political tensions generated by the plague years of the Black Death in the 1340s, the high taxes resulting from the conflict with France during the 100 Years' War, and the instability within the local leadership of London. Inspired by the sermons of the radical cleric John Ball and led by Mr. Wat Tyler, a contingent of Kentish rebels advanced on London. A wide spectrum of rural society, including several local artisans and village officials, along with many local townsfolk, rose up in protest, burning court records and seeking an end to the system of indentured servitude known as serfdom. They set fire to law books and buildings, destroyed Savoy Palace, and killed anyone associated with the royal government. But how was this possible? On the same day, at the same hour, across numerous towns and villages, a largely illiterate populace of commoners arose to rise up against the ruling class. Telephones wouldn't exist for another 500 years. The printing press wouldn't exist for another 150. And yet, somehow, communication was made. It suggests the existence of some underground network of mouth-to-ear communication. Perhaps the most intriguing element of this revolt is that it was inspired by the sermons of the radical cleric John Ball, who is quoted in one of his messages as saying, get this, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. For if God would have had any bondman from the beginning, he would have appointed who should be bond and who free. And therefore I exhort you to consider that now the time is come, appointed to us by God, in which ye may, if you will, cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty." A rather remarkable plea for the late 1300s, don't you think? Ball was an advocate and follower of the philosopher, theologian, and biblical translator John Wycliffe, who was around 15 years older than Ball. Wycliffe was so bold as to question and challenge the privileged status of the clergy, central to their powerful role in England. He was an advocate for the translation of the Bible into the common vernacular, now known as Wycliffe's Bible. Wycliffe's followers were known as the Lollards, and it was the Lollard movement in the middle 1500s that is regarded as the precursor to the Protestant Reformation. Wycliffe is characterized as the evening star of scholasticism and the morning star of the English Reformation. A contemporary of Wycliffe in the early 1600s was the French philosopher René Descartes, dubbed the father of Western philosophy. Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy continues to be a standard text at most university philosophy departments. And a contemporary of Descartes in the later part of the 1600s was John Locke, whose writings influenced Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, many Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, as well as the American revolutionaries. His adherence to classical republicanism and liberal theory are reflected in the United States Declaration of Independence. By briefly examining the concepts and the arguments of these influential spokesmen, we begin to see the seeds of inspiration taking root, a nebula beginning to congeal, a peasant populace with a desire for literacy, a distaste for state-sanctioned theology, a rebuke of indentured servitude, and a growing desire for individual liberty. Why were lodges popping up? Why was Freemasonry growing in popularity? We now have the answer. In a society of monarchies across Europe, where was the only place one could go to gain his freedom? It was in the practice of Masonry. With the skills of the master, a man was able to crawl out from under the blanket of his lord, earl, or even king and truly be free. To be able to travel into foreign countries and be paid wages commensurate with the measure of his skills. No wonder men wanted to join lodges. But in the lodge, the light they received was so much more. Having just endured 500 years of state-sanctioned theologies with the Crusades, the Inquisition, and government-ordered religions of the ruling classes in the monarchies of France, Italy, England, and Spain, it was in a lodge, practicing the rituals and ceremonies of Freemasonry, that a man's mind was put at ease, that as long as he believed in the one true God, his religious convictions were his own. It was in a lodge, practicing the principles of Freemasonry, that a man came to realize that he was as valuable a creation of the Almighty Hand as any member of the ruling class, and that regardless of rank or station, all men were created equal, and each shared equally the responsibility to be a steward of God, administering comfort to those in need to whatever extent one was able. It was in a lodge, practicing the principles of Freemasonry, that a man received an education, not only in matters of an individual's relationship and responsibility to his God, but a literal education promoting advancement through proficiency that would eventually lead to a man's individual freedom. When one can read and can learn of and from history and science, one's mind is literally freed to imagine endless possibilities. It was Freemasonry that cultivated the notions of individual liberty and freedom in a world where it did not exist, and in some places where even entertaining the thought of such liberties could result in persecution or death. Yet it prevailed. Many of us had the pleasure of hearing our past governor, the great Lee Sherman Dreyfus, who so artfully spoke on this subject. The struggle to end the aristocracy of France and deliver freedom to the people was spurred by Freemason James Danton. The Andean mountain region in west central South America, formerly part of the Incan Empire, then under Spanish control, was led to independence by the man whom the country became named, Bolivia's Freemason, Simón Bolívar. In Mexico, freedom fighter and Freemason Benito Juárez. And the fight for America's freedom was led by Freemasons George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Hancock, Paul Revere, George Mason, Joseph Warren, to name just a few. And of course, Dreyfus's question, was this just chance? Or was this on his truss award? It was in Freemasonry that an inspiration blossomed for a socio-political experiment that literally changed the world as we know it. The establishment of a government that for the first time in the history of the world that would be by the people themselves. A government based on the concepts of individual liberty, private land ownership, and capitalist economic theory. And when one considers that the Bill of Rights were written by Freemason George Mason, it becomes clear where the concepts developed for the right of the people to assemble freely, the right to speak freely, the right to practice religion freely. Freemasonry's effect on the world has been greater than any other organization outside of organized religion. And with the more recent emergence into a philanthropy serving a public benevolence, a whole new dimension has been added to the reasons to join Freemasonry. A crippled child who now walks, a burned child no longer deformed, a cleft palate no longer visible, a scoliosis spine straightened, prosthetics on feet, legs, and arms where there were none, and care for the elderly in many of the nation's finest facilities. It really does prove the worth of our efforts. One of the best quotes I've ever read that captures the essence of Masonry comes from 1861 in a piece called The Veil of Isis by Winwood Reade, who writes, "The doctrines of Masonry are the most beautiful that it is possible to imagine. They breathe the simplicity of the earliest ages, animated by the love of a martyred God. That word which the Puritans translated charity, but which is really love, is the keystone which supports the entire edifice of this mystic science. Love one another, teach one another, help one another. That is all our doctrine, all our science, all our law. We have no narrow-minded prejudices. We do not debar from our society this sect or that sect. It is sufficient that a man worships God, no matter under what name or in what manner. Rail against us, bigoted and ignorant men, if you will. Those of us who understand the truths of Masonry can readily forgive you. It is impossible to be a good Mason without being a good man. Let us thank the Grand Lodge of England for the blessings that have been ours to enjoy these last 300 years. And let us constantly rededicate ourselves to be worthy of their legacy as we embark on writing the history for the next 300. Each of us together are really doing the Lord's work, gentlemen. I hope you realize that. And the results that emanate from it are the reason we are so proud of this fraternity, so proud to be associated with it, and so proud to call ourselves Masons. May God richly bless you all.